Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daniel Davis Deep Dive Intel Brief, where we give you the best of the information that we pass along during the week. I know everybody can't see every show, and we don't want you to miss the things that are really important because you need to know what's going on in your world. So we're going to not just share with you what's happened during the week, but also some new things here. And there's something we hadn't shown in a while because he hasn't been talking in a while, and that is the almost ex-President Joe Biden, who made a comment yesterday on the Russia-Ukraine war. Most likely the last one we'll ever hear from him as president on this topic, especially. And okay, as you're watching this, there's a couple things I want you to watch for. One is obviously listen to what he has to say, but the second one is gracious. Look at his body language and I mean, man, obviously it was necessary for him to have dropped out of the race last summer, but gracious, I don't know what would have happened if we'd have had some sort of major crisis or something where we had to have the president of the United States sharp as a tack and all this kind of stuff. Not quite the tack material that you might hope for in the president of the United States. But the other thing that I want you to listen for is that gracious, man, he just is, to the last minute of his presidency, detached from reality.
Well, I had a long talk with Zelensky today. And I think that as long as we continue to keep Western Europe united as it relates to Ukraine, that there is a real chance that the Ukrainians can prevail, because the cost to Russia is incredibly high. Over 600-some-thousand dead or wounded. The Koreans they brought in is having high mortality rates as well. And I made it clear that I provided every bit of funding that authority I have as president to be able to do that now. And I know that there are a significant number of Democrats and Republicans on the Hill who think we should continue to support Ukraine. It is my hope and expectation they'll speak up and not agree to president if Trump decides to cut off funding for Ukraine. Yeah. Putin's in tough shape right now. And I think it's really important that he not have any breathing room to continue to do the god-awful things he's continuing to do. And as I said, he's got his own problems economically, significant problems economically, as well as politically at home. And so I decided to do everything I possibly could within my power and authority to give Ukraine every advantage it could have to be able to sustain support for an independent Ukraine.
When Gary showed me that video this morning, I had to ask him to go back and restart it because I've said, no, I did not hear what he said, but indeed he did. Ukraine has a real chance to prevail, even in this 11th hour, 11:59. I mean, just the last minutes of his candidacy or presidency, he still is trying to claim that Ukraine can win. I mean, I just don't understand what universe you could possibly be living in to be able to say that. And if you don't believe it, if you recognize truth, then why would you say something like that on the way out the door? Because all it does is make you look like genuinely someone that just is not dealing with reality. Either they won't or they can't. But I can assure you, whatever he may think, whatever he may be told, there is no truth to that. There's no way that Ukraine can prevail. It's unlikely that Ukraine can even survive short of a negotiated end to it. In fact, I actually argue that they can't. They won't survive. The army will be defeated in the field, and Russia will impose its will on the country of whatever's left, and they will just issue surrender terms if Trump doesn't come in and get some kind of deal negotiated. And there is one to be had. Putin has said nothing but that they're repeatedly that they're willing to talk. Sergei Lavrov has come out and said there's no preconditions. Peskov has said it. Putin himself has reiterated several times within the last month or so. But they also say that there are certain requirements that they're going to have in any kind of negotiated settlement. They're being very upfront about it. And if, as I've said many times, if Trump is not willing to meet their minimum negotiations, if he wants to try to get a better deal for Ukraine than what the Russians are saying their floor level is, then almost certainly then Russia will just say, okay, it's nice that you have an opinion, but here's what we're going to do. And they're going to continue to march to the West until they have accomplished whatever Putin decides is necessary for their national security. He also, and yeah, thanks for reminding me, Gary. This kind of delusionary thinking is something that I discussed in depth yesterday. But please look back to our main channel page there, and you'll see this picture of the thumbnail. And I show in graphic detail how Biden, the NATO, and the West at large destroyed Ukraine. Now, of course, everybody can say, well, obviously they didn't destroy Ukraine. They tried to prevent that. They tried to help with packages like this. And sure enough, that is the case. And the physical instrument that is destroying Ukraine is the Russian armed forces, as I point out in that show right there. Strongly recommend you go see that, because I chronicle from the war didn't start, as I point out in here, on the 22nd of February, 24th of February, 2022. The war actually started, and I think you can, if you had to pinpoint a day, I would say it was the 22nd of February, 2021, when a deal that had been brokered by the Russians, the European Union, and Ukrainian folks to diffuse the Maidan violence that was going on in the streets there, and would have laid the groundwork for new elections, would have diffused the thing. A political settlement was made. And then the side that the United States was backing, and I go into all the detail on this on the video, started basically lit a fuse that it caused a civil war almost right away, which festered for 8 years and then blew up again on the February 22nd for reasons in there. Everywhere you look from that point forward, all the way through, I show at least 6 different ways that the West could have either prevented war or had a chance to end it early, and several times even, especially throughout 2022, and then again in 2023. And we have failed every time because we will not acknowledge reality. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian people would still be alive today if we had taken any of those opportunities. And now here going out the door, you have President Biden again saying the same thing. If anything, you can at least say he's consistent, and he didn't change his mind at the last, which in this particular case is not good at all. He should have changed his mind. He should have changed his situation. He should have worked with the incoming administration to help ease the way into what Trump is going to try to do. But instead, again, here in the 11th hour, also yesterday, we had John Kirby gave an interview, and he was talking about some of the energy sanctions that the United States had made. And he said, listen, these things are not meant to be negotiating chips. Some people said, oh, well, maybe these sanctions and this additional billions of dollars of support that the administration gave Ukraine was just so that Trump could use them to negotiate a way to try to, bargaining chips, et cetera. But Kirby says, no, that's not the case. These sanctions imposed on Russia are not meant to serve as a bargaining chip to be lifted when Ukraine is ready to negotiate. He added that there is no indication that either side is even prepared to begin negotiations. So you have the spokesman for the White House that's saying, hey, yeah, we're not interested in negotiations. They're going to go to the last minute of the 4 years that they were in power, throughout the entire nearly 3 years of this war now. And they're going to the last, say no negotiations, no diplomacy, no peace, only war. And so they're doing everything they can to facilitate that. And as I point out in that other show there, all it does is get more Ukrainians killed. It won't change the outcome. It won't make anything better for Ukraine. It won't save anything for Ukraine. All it has been is a territorial loss, the destruction of its cities, the absolute emaciation and destruction of generations of Ukrainians that will never be allowed or able to rise again. Probably over 1 million people have been severely wounded and are going to have all kinds of troubles even afterwards. I think upwards of 20 million Ukrainians have fled their country as a result of all this fighting, everything that began here. So they're going to be a shell of what they were. They'll never recover probably to their really even their 2013 self, much less the 1991 self that they had. And all because we would not acknowledge reality. That's just how it is. And we show on there. Okay, next thing, one of the things that Biden also said in that clip there was he said, hey, Putin is in really tough shape because of all these sanctions and everything else and all the battlefield losses that they've been suffering, implying that their army is going to fall apart. So if we just support a little bit longer, Russia will fall apart. Well, we said, hey, you know what? We've had Ukraine Western people who have fought for Ukraine on their side of the war. And we said, let's show both sides of this coin. So we actually went to Aidan Minnis, who was a former British soldier. I'm sorry, a former British citizen. He was not a British soldier that joined the fight against Russia. And he explained what he's fighting for, what he's willing to die for. And he'll show you they aren't quite as weak on the Russian side as Biden seems to think. What is the just cause that you think you're fighting for?
Well, to drive fascists in Bandera ideology out of the Donbass, at least out of the eastern regions that decided to join the Russian Federation. And of course, it's also a de facto fight against NATO, for Russia to have its place in the world and not be bullied or financially raped like it was in the 90s. Because in my view, that's what the West want to do. They want to subjugate Russia, and I genuinely believe that you have evil and demonic forces that run these countries in the West, and they need to be stopped. So it's something that, I'll be honest, Daniel, I'm prepared to die for.
And what do you say to those people who claim that Russia's real intent, Putin's real intent, is to conquer NATO, to go beyond Ukraine, and just once they have subjugated Ukraine, that they're just going to continue rolling to the West?
I think in terms of war, there will always be geopolitical goals that both sides want to achieve, but ultimately, I don't think that's going to happen, because if that were to happen, you would see a full mobilization of the armed forces in Russia, which hasn't happened. They're not even fully mobilized, which the world doesn't want to talk about. They try and portray it as an all-in Russian invasion, which it isn't. And you would see big arrow offensives, which you're not seeing. This is a hybrid war. And I get the impression, and I think personally, that it's about gaining's the wrong word, about liberating these territories that decided to want to stay with Russia. And of course, they want to denazify Ukraine. But to answer your question specifically, no, I wouldn't be involved in a war, nor would I want to be involved in a war if it's for territorial gain only.
And look, he says a number of things there which validate what we see on the ground. So in terms of, okay, it's just propaganda. He's just repeating Russian propaganda. That's what many people in the West would say to anyone on the Russian side. Of course, unfortunately, that's actually mirrored on our side in reverse. But we'll touch on that here a bit later. But one of the things he says, which validates this idea that despite what many in the West say, Russia doesn't have some idea to revitalize the USSR, to subsume Ukraine back into it, as what's his face? Anthony Blinken, their so-called Secretary of State, our so-called chief diplomat, tried to say just this past week as well. Yeah, this is all about Russia doing that. And yet, if that was true, if what Blinken said was true, instead of what Aidan Minnis said was true, you would have seen Russia mobilize, not just say if we can get a bunch of recruits in each month, 30 to 40,000, depending on which month it is, but it's quite robust. But it's volunteer. They have to have good financial incentives. They have to have good things, the good conditions to offer them, et cetera, because they're going to go to war, but they have to choose to do that. If the Russian state had an idea that they wanted to go further than Ukraine, further than the Dnieper River even, they would have to mobilize. They have somewhere around 1.3, 1.4 million active troops at the moment in the army. But if they were going to do that kind of a job, they would need 2 or 3, probably closer to 3 million active troops to be able to go and just maraud across Western Europe. That's what they would have to have. And you haven't seen that. You haven't seen the full mobilization even of industry. You've seen, I think it's like 12, 13% higher than it was before the war, or maybe it's I think I may be wrong on these numbers, but it's a considerable portion of the Russian GDP, way more than the 3 point something that it is for the United States. So they have gone quite a bit up, but they haven't gone to full mobilization, which they could do in both their society, industry, and then their manpower, of course. And of course, Russians, and I don't know if you're aware of how their system works, but they have mandatory service of all young men. So they have to serve, I think it's a year in the armed forces, and then they get mobilized out. So you have a large multi-million person cohort of Russian men that have some military experience. They wouldn't be coming in from scratch if they wanted to mobilize and if they wanted to have this huge conquering army. They never did that. And then you heard that was Aiden's view, and others, I understand, have the same view, that they are fighting tooth and nail, and they have the desire to win here because they view this as an existential fight. They don't view it as Russia, Ukraine. They view it as Russia against NATO. And of course, we brag all the time that there are 50 nations on the side of NATO, and sometimes they're using Western weapons fire inside by partially operated by the Western military into Russia, et cetera. So to them, this is an existential fight. But you see, the fight is what he also mentioned there. It is focused on the Ukraine territory in the east, where the Russian feels like that the ethnic Russians were being, as they view it, were being abused and killed by the Ukrainian army in the civil war that had started before. And then, of course, all the onslaught that's happened since that time. So whether anybody likes it or not, the Russian objectives are limited. And Putin has specifically said in his 14 June line that it's all four of the current oblasts that they annexed in 2022, which includes substantial territory that Ukraine still owns today. That would have to be negotiated away, or in my view, that I think that my assessment, based looking at the map and at all the geopolitical things that are going on, the diplomacy, the public statements, et cetera, the force structure that they have, I think that they are preparing not to just occupy those four areas here, because I think that they don't believe that Trump will negotiate those away. And I think that they're prepared to go all the way to the Dnieper River. They do have, from what the size of their force is, they do have enough to do that over time, should they choose to do that. And it could be a situation where, I'll just talk about this for a second militarily, where if the Russians decided to do that and they just continued fighting and there was no negotiated settlement, then it could take many months to do that, 7, 8, 9 months, possibly even, to be able to conquer that much territory. Or because of how weak the fabric is of the Ukraine army, even as bravely as they have fought in tenacious against all odds, and they have, with all the imbalance in the manpower and especially the firepower that they have been suffering, it's entirely possible, and historically has many times happened, where a force will break and all of a sudden it's like the dam burst and water just floods into an area. And we could see that. It could happen at any time, or it may never happen. It's just no one knows, because it's the human psyche that can't be measured or predicted. So we'll have to see. But what can be predicted is just the military balance. It's irrevocably on the Russian side, and unless some diplomatic thing stops it, that onslaught will continue, likely up to the Dnieper River, and then we'll see what happens from there. But that's what our current government is unwilling to acknowledge, and still to this day has this fiction that it's still possible for the Ukraine side to prevail. Well, let's look at a different aspect here. We had Ambassador Chaz Freeman on this week, and he was addressing something that's going to make some of our Western friends uncomfortable, but it's something that needs to be addressed, because how many times have you heard senior leaders throughout NATO, European Union, and the United States say, Ukraine is the best democracy against the autocracy of the Russians, and we have to defend our democracy? Ambassador Freeman said, let's examine that prospect.
There's a lot of nonsense about this being democracy versus autocracy or whatever. Ukraine doesn't have a democracy. It suspended its elections. Its president is in office through martial law. It's closed all its independent press. It has broken with the Russian Orthodox Church and insisted on establishing its own religious establishment. This is a very authoritarian country, and it is not a democracy. And this is one of the reasons that getting it into the European Union, which is an obvious thing to do, is going to take decades, probably, because it has to cure corruption. Ukraine is the most corrupt country in Europe. It was that before the war, and it's even worse now. is not a democracy. It doesn't have a functioning economy. It's totally dependent on handouts from the US taxpayer and Europeans to keep its government in business. Time is not on Ukraine's side. And I think Mr. Trump, to his credit, clearly recognizes that.
Well, I'm sure Trump recognizes. There's no question that he does. It's just like I keep saying and telling anyone who will listen, especially among my Western colleagues, his hand is very weak. His negotiating capacity, the leverage that he has is just very limited. And he's going to have to make some pretty big concessions or the fighting will continue. And that's just going to be super hard for President Trump to do because he loves to come out with a win. But unfortunately, in this case, a win probably means limiting the damage, the further damage to the Ukraine side. And that'll be hard because his political opponents here in the United States will just excoriate him, et cetera. But, you know, in terms of people being unwilling to look at reality, I just showed you President Biden. He talked about having had a long conversation with President Zelensky. Well, Zelensky seems equally detached from reality. And instead of recognizing all of the issues that we just raised about the imbalance in the military power and the fact that Trump's coming in expressly and exclusively to try to find a negotiated deal, he's not even talking about the possibility of continuing to support Ukraine. Zelensky's position is something real odd.
Listen, we need to be in a strong position and not talk, but end the war. Yes, it is possible through dialogue. We're not opposed to it. You just need to be in a strong position to make the other person want it. Do you think he wants to end the war? That's what you suggested? I think this is naive. I'm sorry. With all due respect, it's naive to think he wants to finish the war.
Yeah, naive is to think that Putin desires to just loves conquest and just loves military fighting. I know that's a popular view, popular mentality on the West. It just doesn't match up on the ground. Putin has every incentive to negotiate this war to a conclusion. It would be far better for the Russian side to be able to get a negotiated settlement to get the security that they have been fighting for all along, if they can get it through negotiations without having to lose any more troops and can end the dying on their own side. So he does have motivation, but his ultimate goal is higher than just the protection of his troops. It's the security of his entire nation. And right now, there's not going to be any people who have this idea that the war can be frozen on the current line and then have a North-South Korea type situation with the DMZ. Folks, there is no way that's going to happen. The only reason it happened in the Korea in this because the two sides had come to an equilibrium and neither side could force the issue one way or the other. We're not there right now. In this situation, it is not an equilibrium. The Russians are on the absolute superiority and the power imbalance grows by the day in Russia's favor. So there won't be any freezing of the line. There will be Russia getting what it wants, what it feels like it must have for its national security. And that includes not just the territory, but that also includes declarations of no NATO and however they want to define denazification, which the Russians use. And it's unclear what that would look like too, but that would have to be part of negotiations. And I would wager that means no Volodymyr Zelensky. So Trump would probably have to negotiate that away too. So you see how nearly impossible the deal is for Trump to try to negotiate something that could end the war short of additional conquest. That's one of the things I really wanted to point out here, how tough the situation is going to be for Trump to come in. And in my view, the most likely outcome is that Russia continues its war without pause and goes all the way to the Dnieper River, even if it takes another 9 months, even if we're still fighting this in the late summer, early autumn of 2025. We'll have to wait and see how that works out. Then we went to Larry Johnson, one of our faves on here, Larry the Shirt Johnson. And he wanted he asked him to address whether Russia will agree to Western military in Ukraine as part of any post-settlement. One of the things being floated about is, especially by Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, even Olaf Scholz, and certainly some folks in Poland are all saying, maybe we'll put some troops in there as peacekeepers afterwards. Not that we need to really answer that question. I think it's pretty self-evident, but Larry did anyway.
They're not just looking to prevent Ukraine from ascending to NATO. They want an end to all of this Western military activity, because even though Ukraine was never a member of NATO over the last, let's go back 17 years, go back to 2008. In this intervening 17 years, the United States and the other NATO countries have been conducting annual and many times multiple military exercises every year. And those exercises only have one purpose: attacking Russia. Ostensibly, oh, we're defending against the Russian attack. Nonsense. This is prepping the West to attack Russia, and Russia's been watching all along. That's going to end. Russia's going to put an end to that. That's not just keeping Ukraine out of NATO. It's putting a stop to this military intervention and this desire to build up a Ukrainian military that can attack and challenge Russia.
You know what, really, a lot of this gets down to a level of trust. Everybody on the West loves to say, well, we can't trust Putin. They never keep their agreements. They never do anything. And from the Russian side, they say we can never trust the West. They never keep their agreements. They never do anything. And both sides can provide some kind of evidence. But look, here's the reality of it. Because both sides have had a dearth of trust, and I would wager, and I would argue rather, that the level of mistrust on the Russian side has a little bit more credibility than that on the other side, though Russia is certainly guilty of some violating many agreements, whatever. It's nothing compared to how much we have violated agreements, how many agreements we've outright just got rid of unilaterally because we didn't like them anymore. We didn't want to be constrained by them. Most of that's come back to bite us in the butt because of, you know, once we get rid of the constraints, then Russia no longer feels constrained. They keep going on. But I mean, and let's even go back to the Minsk agreements, because the Minsk agreements required in 2015 for a cessation of the conflict, moving back of heavy weapons. And then the Ukraine side was supposed to change its constitution that gave political autonomy to the Donbass area, Luhansk and Donetsk specifically, so that eventually all of it would come back under the control of Kiev. Had the United States done that, and I also talk about this at some length in the show I mentioned that we did yesterday about how the U.S. NATO has basically destroyed Ukraine. We violated this and never intended to agree to it. That has been made public. It's not just innuendo. It's not just, you know, some claim is on the Russian side. It's actually stated in an interview, which we cite in yesterday's show, that shows that, yes, Hollande of France, Angela Merkel from Germany, never intended for it to be. They just wanted to pause to build time up for the Ukraine side to get stronger so that they could eject Russia that way. And I think that's one of the reasons why Zelensky in 2021, unbeknownst to hardly anybody in the West, actually signed a government decree and a law that said they would oust all of the Russians from all of the occupied territories, especially Crimea, which is like waving a red cape in front of a bull. And we got what we got. But you see from the Russian side is they negotiated a deal, and they see that the West never had any intention to abide by it. So now then they have to ask the legitimate question: why should they negotiate now? And upon what basis would they have trusted the Western side would do what it says it's going to do? And you can get a lot better deal. This is one of the reasons why I say it's so important to keep your word, even to your enemies, your outright enemies, adversaries, your friends, everybody. Your word should be your bond, because if people can see, if nations can see that you mean what you say and you negotiate any kind of terms that are a win-win on any subject, and they see that you mean it, then they're more willing to actually give more. They're actually willing to do things that are more to your benefit if they know they can trust you. But if they believe they can't trust you, and it doesn't matter what you say, that they can, what is it? Reagan used to say, trust but verify. But right now, they can't even have the trust to get to the verify. So that means that we give incentive, follow the logic here, because of all the things we have failed to do and all the lies that we've told and all the deception we've had. Now then we give incentive to the Russian side to say, man, I'm not going to make any deal that I can't secure with my own hands, because they won't want to trust anything. So they give us no leverage, no flexibility at all. And that means that the increasing probability is that they will not even have a negotiated settlement, but will say, we're going to win by force of arms what we must have for our security. And then when I don't even have to rely on you, I don't have to trust you anymore, then we can have a negotiated settlement, which frankly will be closer to just terms of surrender. That's what I think the big risk is. And so all the stuff I put in that yesterday's show is everything from 2013 all the way up to yesterday. But now then the things that I'm talking about here are going to still have an impact on everything going forward and how this thing even gets negotiated. That is so important to understand, that it's not just a matter of the negotiation power between Trump and Putin, but it's all the things that have come before it, all of it going into how this is going to work out right now. And because our side has been unwilling to acknowledge military reality, we have again put ourselves as a collective West into a very weak spot where we just don't have the leverage to get what we want. And I think we're going to see how that plays out here. One of the last things, the last thing I want to talk about here today is something that Patrick Henningsen said on the show this week, which I thought was painful to put in, and it's unpleasant to have to play again here. But one of the reasons why I think that many in the West have been unwilling to acknowledge reality, continue up until the final minutes of the Biden administration to continue to go down this path, is because even though the Ukraine side has been the bill payer, even though, as I pointed out, it's been the Ukrainian military, their personnel, their civilians, their cities, their territory has just been crushed, and most of it is now lost forever to the Russian side. Some people benefit from it on the West. And I asked Patrick to weigh in on that.
Ukraine is still standing. This war is about money. People don't talk much about it. But you know the richest country in all of Europe for rare earth minerals is Ukraine. $2 to $7 trillion worth of minerals that are rare earth minerals, very relevant to the 21st century. Ukraine's ready to do a deal with us, not the Russians. So it's in our interest to make sure that Russia doesn't take over the place. It's the breadbasket of really the developing world. 50% of all the food going to Africa comes out of Ukraine. We can make money and have an economic relationship with Ukraine that'd be very beneficial to us with peace. So Donald Trump's going to do a deal to get our money back, to enrich ourselves with rare earth minerals, a good deal for Ukraine and us.
He's the spokesperson for the bondholders of the debt that we are currently and continuously piling on top of Ukraine, debt that we'll never be able to pay back, but it's having to basically promise its resources, or what's left of any of its resources, to the West, to the people, to the bondholders, to their creditors. And when you're talking about what territory they've lost, that was the ROI for BlackRock, for all of these, massive funds that were basically parking their money behind a totally different outcome from this conflict. And they wanted to privatize and basically loot, rape, and pillage, basically finish off Ukraine with what little was left after George Soros got done with it for the last 25 years. They pick apart the carcass and take what's left. And of course, the rare earth minerals, Lindsay's talking about that. That was the ROI. They're upset. They're not getting their ROI. And I wonder, Daniel, if a lot of the craziness that you see in Washington, this doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on this bad bet, is the bondholders, is the big money in the background pushing their politicians, saying, do something. We need an ROI. We've lost here. There's nothing for us here. If Russia continues on the line of contact where it currently is and maybe increases its position to the Dnieper River, they're beside themselves. But these are not military people. These are bankers. These are people sitting in Manhattan. These are people sitting in the city of London. They're in Dusseldorf and Frankfurt. Okay, they don't understand. To them, it's a game of Risk. It's a board game. But the realities on the ground, they're so out of touch with. And Lindsey Graham is the embodiment of that, because he's the mouthpiece of that big money.
And you know what's so perverse about this? I was talking about this to a colleague a couple of days ago. Had we made a deal, let's say early on, obviously, if we had made the negotiations that were on the table in the fall of 2021, the war would never have been fought at all. But after it did start, we another deal was on the table in Istanbul in March, April 2022. Had we made that deal then, the majority of Ukraine would still be under Kiev's control. Now the war would have stopped. All of this rare earth materials that Lindsey Graham's talking about, all of this rich farmland that he's talking about, a lot of it in the Donbass area, all of it would have been wide open for all these bankers and all these other people that Patrick talked about there, and they would have been able to exploit it. So even if they were just being self-interested money grubbers, that was the right path to go through. And the Ukraine people would have lived. They would have benefited from it, because this whole area here where the line of contact is, and where most of the fighting has been going on for the past 12, 14 months, has been absolutely devastating. And in fact, you actually go back to 2023, because that would, a deal at Istanbul would have prevented the Ukrainian offensive in 2023. And that whole area, there were millions of mines that were seeded. And now then there are literally many thousands, right, tens of thousands of military vehicles, carcasses spread throughout all that area. And all, instead of being farmed, it's now a no man's land because it's so dangerous. There's unexploded ordnance. I mean, it's been devastated. All the areas that now where you claim these rare earths are, where do you think that's going to end up? Because you wouldn't acknowledge reality, because you wouldn't use diplomacy when you had it, you're handing it to the Russians. I mean, do these people not get it? How catastrophic the decisions are on a moral and a human level to the Ukrainian people because of this abject unwillingness or inability to acknowledge reality has had for the Ukrainians. That alone is a mammoth problem that is, I think, going to be something that we have to pay for a long time. And it has severely tarnished the reputation of the United States, which has ripple ramifications going on in many ways that we may not yet see. But even if you just wanted to go to the baseline greediness, doing a deal earlier would have preserved every bit of that. And now then, because we wouldn't, and the almost certainty, or the highly likelihood anyway, that Russia is going to go much further to the west than the current line of contact is as of today, so much of that material will now be under the control of the Russians. And none of these bankers or under these big supporters, they're not even going to have access to it. It's going to go to the Russian side. That's the harsh reality of what greed can do to you. It destroys your friends and the people that we claim we're trying to fight and support for. All we've done is enable their destruction. And then now the side that we said at the very beginning, President Biden on the 24th of February of 2022 laid out there right at the beginning, our objective were to see Ukraine prevail and see Russia fail. That was what he said there. Lloyd Austin in April of that same year. Our objective is to weaken Russia. That's what we said right from the beginning. And what's going to be the net? It's Ukraine that has been severely weakened. It is NATO that has been severely weakened because just our physical military infrastructure alone has been gutted because we handed it off to the Ukrainian side to have it end up in rust heaps in the middle of Ukraine. So our capacity is weaker. Russia's capacity is now bigger, stronger, and more experienced than it was before. And now then, even economically, you've handed over this area that can then be used as a, in many years from now, because it's going to take a long time to demine and to make the land usable again for large scale farming. It's going to take a long time, but that's going to go to the Russian orbit and what's left of the eastern, what has been Ukraine now is being absorbed into the Russian Federation. And then, of course, all the rare earth materials, et cetera, it's all going over there. Every way you want to look, our actions throughout this whole thing have just been abysmal, immoral, and just unethical and just ineffective. And it's just terrible. And it's yet to know how big the final bill is going to be and who all is going to end up paying for it. But listen, I'm all for President Trump coming in and doing this. I've been nothing but a supporter of his ideas there to bring this war to a negotiated settlement. That's why I was glad that he chose J.D. Vance as the vice president, because he has been outspoken that the war can't be won. You may remember that New York Times piece in April of 2024, where he said it's a math problem. The math isn't there. We need to have a negotiated settlement, et cetera. All that is true, but we have to be sober-minded about this, because there's not much negotiating leverage in his hands, and things could get a lot worse. And then it's an open question of what Trump would do about that. Is he going to just concede to that and say, all right, this is a bad business deal like he's had in the past? Sometimes you just got to cut your losses and move on to whatever's next. I hope that's what he does, because that's what is, because of the hand that's been dealt to him, that's probably the best you can get right now. But there is worse. If you don't play that bad hand well, it can still get worse. And it's unclear what Trump would do if he tries to force an issue to get, what he may consider a better terms than what's being offered, and then ends up with something worse. So we'll be monitoring this close here, the post 20 January, as he assumes office and moves forward and actually starts taking action on this. We will definitely keep you up to date on all that's going on, giving you the latest breaking information and analysis about what decisions are being made and what statements are being made. Come to Daniel Davis Deep Dive and we'll give you all that. In the meantime, hope you have a great weekend. Thanks for being with us this week. Look very much forward to having you next week, and we'll see you then on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.